Thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Just the article in the purebred pigeon that was a real eye catcher. That was really cool.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys liked it. It's definitely a very unique breed, one that a lot of people aren't even aware that it originated in the United States, and it's unfortunately much more rare than I would like it to be.
Even right now, it still hasn't really come back that much.
Yeah, it's definitely had a resurgence over the last couple of years, and there's really been an interesting evolution of the breed. And I cover this pretty extensively in the purebred pigeon article that you referenced. The breed is quite an old breed. It's been around for a number of years. It's not new per se, but it is definitely a breed that a lot of people aren't familiar with simply because it isn't shown very frequently. And so because of that, there's not a lot of exposure to the breed. And so, it's pretty interesting. Whenever I have them in a show, people say pretty frequently they've heard of them, but they've never actually seen them. And so it's, not a new breed. And a lot of folks who haven't seen them, I mean, it lends to the fact that they need to be shown more frequently and exposure needs to increase. But it's definitely it's the first breed I started with more than 30 years ago, and I fell in love with them. Certainly loved other pigeon breeds along the way. They've got a special place in my heart and certainly a special place in my loft.
Yeah, no, I personally, I love rolling up and seeing a bird that I've only ever read about or heard about. It's always cool to see it in person for the first time. So, hopefully that put a spark in some people when they saw them.
Yeah, hopefully so. Hopefully so. Yeah, the journey, a little bit of the history on the breed, and I think that's always fascinating. The standard mentions the history of the breed as well, and it's not very often that you have a breed that's in the NPA standards that talks about the origin and the breeds that were used to create this particular breed. And there's a lot of nuances that this is simply a marking of swing pouter, and it's the same breed that is found in Europe, which is simply not true. It's vastly different. Even though they are related over time, they've certainly evolved and changed, just like German Modinas, for instance. It's a radically different breed than what has come with a more modern Modena today. The American Bohemian Pouter, if you read the creation of the breed, it's a result of farmers from the Czech Republic and from Germany and from Slovakia that immigrated to the United States at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. It brought with them pigeons that they predominantly used for food, and these individuals settled in the Midwest, and they had these various breeds of swing style pouters, and they started breeding them towards a specific marking and a specific standard, and over time morphed away from the original breeds that they brought with them. The breeds that were most commonly referenced are the Staubach and Stellar, and they're very different today in Europe. The breeds have certainly evolved and morphed, and there's sort of this unique component where a lot of the Bohemians, I should say a lot, but there was definitely a distinct variety of Bohemian pouters that were plain headed, meaning that they have a bald head and they don't have that familiar forehead snip. But unique about that particular marking was they often would come crested. And there is a interesting component there, because neither the Staubach nor the Stellar are crested breeds, nor do they have that same marking with the bald head magpie marked bird. And so after having traveled a lot in Europe, I work in Europe pretty frequently. I spent a pretty considerable amount of time trying to track down is sort of where this missing link came from, of this this plain-headed pouter that's crested with a peak. And I discovered Moravian croppers, and it's interesting, at least to me, that the the individuals who brought these Stavak and Stellars to the United States from the Czech Republic and Germany, most of them were from Czechoslovakia. And at that time, Czechoslovakian immigrants were most commonly referred to as being Bohemian. The music, the dance, and culture was quite prevalent during that time period. And so these powders were referred to as Bohemian powders. But the other kingdom of the Czech Republic is Moravia, and it's historically made up of two kingdoms, and there's two distinct types of pigeons there. But very, very fascinating. Unfortunately, the Moravian cropper is also extremely rare in Europe, and there's it is a Slovakian breed, or commonly referred to as a Slovakian breed. And in the Slovakian breeder directory for the club, there's I can't remember the precise number, but something like 35 breeders in Europe with that particular breed. So quite limited there as well.
Interesting. So with the American Bohemian powder, have you come across it at all over there?
So the Stavak and Stellars are much more common, and the Stellar has a familiar marking, but they're a much different shaped bird. They have a bit of frontal. They've got a different colored ice ear. Their leg and body positioning is also quite different, and their globe shape and structure is also different. So about the only two critical items that they have in common is the marking and the fact that they're in the powder and cropper family.
Let's open this up. Hello and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. I'm Phil.
Chris.
And today we have with us Ryan Bateman. There is an article on him in the September-October issue of Purebred Pigeon, The Return of the American Bohemian Pouter. And Ryan has done a great deal in bringing back this breed here where it belongs in the U.S. He's going to talk with us about that today. So Ryan, thanks for coming on. This has been great.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it. And you give me more credit than I deserve. It's definitely been a passion of mine to help restore the American Bohemian powder to its historical prevalence and hopefully beyond that. But certainly it's truly the work of a great number of individuals before. Certainly there's a lot of other breeders that have worked very deeply in helping to save this heritage breed of powder from the United States.
Yeah, I was talking with someone the other day about how there's so many different breeds of pigeons that have existed for so long. It's like, who's putting in this work? There's so many, over 600 breeds, and they've been around for thousands of years, and it's kind of amazing that more breed. I mean, I'm sure that it happens, but it's kind of amazing that there's not just more big fall-offs of a breed totally going extinct. And this is really great right here, like how the efforts that you've gone through and giving other people high quality birds to breed to keep this breed alive and keep it going.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's quite astonishing. Rare breeds are pretty prevalent within pigeons, as you say. There's so many breeds of pigeons, and they're from all different places, throughout the world. And it's interesting how popularity sort of waxes and wanes with particular breeds. I've raised pigeons for a little over 3 decades, and during that time period, breeds that were very rare have come back in great numbers, and then others have nearly vanished. It is impressive that there are so many breeds of pigeons, and I'm also surprised that more breeds have completely disappeared.
And this is a NPA recognized breed, right?
It sure is. Yeah, it became a recognized breed about I believe it was late 80s when they started the efforts to formally recognize it. Then I think it officially became a recognized breed in the early 90s, so around 30 years ago. But the breed is much older than that, of course, having originated in the United States as a result of these Czech and Slovakian and German immigrants bringing different types and styles of sweetened powders to the United States and breeding towards this new version or variety of powder that today we refer to as the American Bohemian powder. Most of those immigrants were in the United States by before World War I. So well over 110 years ago. the breed has been raised predominantly in the Midwest by people of Czech, Slovakian, or German heritage predominantly. A couple of things I mentioned in the article, and I found this pretty interesting in doing research on the breed. They really were used for food. They're amazing parents, so sort of unique compared to most powder breeds. They're usually free flown, and I've been to Europe and I've seen the ancestors of these birds, and the farmers that I visited, they fly the birds every day, and they in many cases still eat the mismarked birds. And because it's such a difficult marking to master, there's always plenty of opportunity to put a couple of pigeons in the pot. I personally have never consumed them, but I know a lot of the early breeders when I was a kid who had Bohemian Pouters absolutely loved consuming them. They certainly loved to raise them, but they also enjoyed them from a agricultural point of view as well.
That's really weird to think about a pouter being considered a meat bird. I mean, to me, the pouter is like a big deal at the fancy.
Yeah, agreed. And they're quite a large powder, comparatively speaking. But it's sometimes interesting when I'm showing them. Judges will expect them to be, tighter waisted and more style or shape of a Vorburg cropper or a Norwich cropper, etc., with a tight waist and a larger globe. But the breed has it's a medium-sized globe that's pear-shaped, and the body is quite large. I mean, the cock's expected to be about 1.5 feet long from the tip of their beak to the tip of their tail. So it's quite a large bird, and they're very, very heavy too. Well over a pound in weight. So for powder, there's quite a lot of substance, and they're expected to be very strong in birds that should still be able to fly freely, which my birds, I do not fly, but a number of whom I've given them to still fly them today.
That's my new powder breed.
Hey, sounds great. We need more guys like you, and ladies too.
I've got 3 different kinds of powders, and my favorites are the horsemen, because I can fly them.
Yes, I raised them for a number of years. I love the personality of the horsemen, and also enjoy the ease of marking. That's very nice. The horseman actually is a breed when Bohemians became quite scarce in the United States in the 2010s, and it really even in the last 5 the 10 years, it was pretty common that people would outcross Bohemians with horsemen just because of their horsemen's prevalence during that time period. Unfortunately, it doesn't really net you a good bird from a Bohemian powder point of view. It's the wrong body, and it's the wrong coloration, among many other things, of course. But great for flying. Definitely a heavier powder with a lot more strength and endurance than other breeds of powders would generate.
I have runners and Vorburg croppers too.
Very nice. I actually for a long time, I kept just Bohemian powders from a powder point of view, but today I have Vorburgs, and I have the American Bohemian powders. I've tried to import some Moravian croppers. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well. We're going to try again here. Me and a couple other breeders from some breeders that I've met in Slovakia over the years and I've been working with since just before COVID. If I might share just a couple of things, we talked about sort of rare breeds and this evolution. I think one of the most fascinating things about the Bohemian powder is they originally were utility based. I don't want to call them a utility breed, but they were used for food and flying, etc. But the breed, the people who kept them predominantly kept them for utility purpose. And while they would cull the birds that matched the body shape, style, personality, and marking and color that they were breeding towards, there was a distinct variety that came out of these breeding programs. But it was interesting that over the course of the years, the breed started to go away, and it was because these older farmers that were from these immigrant families in the Midwest, as they started to pass away, a lot of their children and grandchildren had terrible memories of eating these pigeons, these dirty, rotten pigeons, and that was the last thing that they wanted. They didn't really see the value in them as a breed. They just remember grandma and grandpa forcing them to eat pigeon. And I've heard that story dozens of times while showing Bohemians with older individuals that will see them at a show and happen to be from the Midwest, and they recognize the breed, but that's their connection, is that their grandparents or in some cases their parents had them, and they were almost always used for food.
I wonder if that happens with other people who were raised with kings and stuff like that, get kind of turned off, like, oh, these are just chickens in a way or something,
Yes, I think you're probably right. And in the late 1980s, the breed started to disappear. A pretty small group of breeders came together. There were a lot of articles written in various powder club bulletins, and there was this conversation about the Bohemians that they're excellent parents. That's not the issue. It's there just aren't enough people promoting them, and they saw that there was a relatively small number of breeders who had them, and nobody was really showing them because, first of all, they weren't an accepted breed in the MPA, but they were often shown in state fairs in Minnesota and Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, etc. But they weren't really shown at a national level. And there was a small group of individuals that got together and decided that they needed to build a club for the breed. And so in the mid-90s, a club was established. In fact, I have the old club banner that was given to me by the late Merle Frank. The club was established in 1994. I hang it in my office here, actually, where I'm taking the call today. And the club later disbanded, not quite a decade later. They established the club, and they got the standard passed. And going all the way back to 1984, I can find articles from Bob Cusick and Merle Frank and Herberg writing these articles saying that they needed to really save the breed, because it was at that point almost nearly 100 years of breeding the breed. There was no formalized standard, and they needed to come together to really memorialize the breed and to solidify it as a legitimate breed in the United States. Even though it was really popular in the Midwest, it was not very popular on either the East Coast or the West Coast, or throughout the southern states, and really almost found exclusively in the U.S. There are breeders, or were breeders, I should say, in Canada, and I know of at least one breeder in Mexico that used to raise the breed as well. But aside from North America, you really don't find the American Bohemian powder. Things sort of come in cycles, and so we've seen the breed fall down in the 80s and the late 70s, where it was nearly extinct, and then these group of breeders came together and rebuilt the breed and built the club. And then in the mid 90s, it was actually one of the most common breeds of powders kept, at least within the Southern Powder and Cropper Club, which was a fairly large all-breed powder club in the U.S. at that time. I believe it eventually became the American Powder Club and so on. But they published a breeder directory. It was quite extensive, and the Bohemian was the third most common breed of powder that was kept. But they weren't often kept as a primary breed. They were normally used as feeders for other large breeds of powders and croppers. And so people weren't really prioritizing the breed, in the show hall and also in their loft. Fast forward a couple years later, or really more about a decade later, and a lot of these guys that had, a lot of stamina in helping to rebuild the breed are really frustrated. In fact, you can find a lot of articles from these individuals that were aforementioned. They stopped showing them. They didn't stop raising them, but they stopped showing them and promoting them, because the Bohemian powder was never picked as an overall champion for powders. And they're an extremely challenging breed to raise a good one from a marking and body and color point of view. No matter how hard they tried, they would always be looked over for another bird. And most of these guys, of course, raised other breeds of Pouters, and it wasn't that they themselves wouldn't win, but they felt like the breed was sort of looked over as an American creation, and it wasn't as legitimate as some of these other breeds, even Vorbergs, which are, a fairly new breed, of course, also, coming from the 1900s. And in really, I believe 1960s, 1970s, they became a legitimate breed. So they're very new as well.
Yeah. So you said that these do a good job as far as parents go. Even people use them as fosters. What are some of like the pros and cons of this breed? Like especially with the Pouter breed, like are they more prone to sour crop or not? Or they do raise their young? They fly, which is I think is cool. What are some of the other pros and cons about getting into this breed?
Great question, and thank you for asking. To me, and I'm of course biased, but I'll start off by saying I've raised over 60 breeds of pigeons, and I've raised over 20 breeds of Pouters and Croppers, and I really find that I gravitate towards Pouters and Bohemians, and we'll get into this in a moment, but because of their scarcity, a few years ago, I decided to double down my efforts on just focusing on the Bohemian Pouters as a primary breed. But from a pro and con point of view, I genuinely have not found a Pouter that's a better parent. I think the horsemen are very, very similar in terms of the way that they rear young. I have never, in 3 decades of raising Bohemians, ever had a scalped baby in my loft of Bohemians. And just to put this into perspective, I live in the Rockies. I'm at 4,500 feet in elevation. I raised 200 Bohemian Pouters last year out of 15 pair. And I don't use foster parents. They are the parents of their own young, of course. And I raise birds all 12 months of the year. And they're very hardy. From the age of banding, I actually just did a count before I got on the call. I lost 6 birds last year after I put a band on them. And most of them were in the month of January. And it was extremely cold, unseasonably cold here in the Rockies last year with all the snow and cold weather that we had. So, very, very strong birds. And the year prior, I only lost 1 post-banding. So, excellent parents, they sit tight, they raise their young very well. I would say a con is that their markings are tough. Magpie marked birds, anybody who's raised a magpie marked bird knows the difficulty in keeping, the markings clean. And then you throw a forehead snip on top of it. And then the fact that they need to be show trained and globed like any other Pouter, but yet they're a breed that's very strong and healthy and vibrant, and they can fly. So they're less, I would say, tame than a lot of Pouters, but I think that's probably why they're really good parents. They've got a little more wild instinct in them. You mentioned sauerkraut. I've only ever had 2 instances of sauerkraut with Bohemians in 30 years, and both times it was related to their water running out in the middle of the heat. And both times I was traveling and had somebody else, a neighbor kid, taking care of the birds, and that was the result. But the birds survived in spite of having sauerkraut. So, very different than say a Norwich or an English or Vorbergs. Much less prevalence of sauerkraut for sure.
And you run a Facebook group specifically for this breed as well.
I do. Yeah, I have a Facebook group, and a little bit on the backstory there. So, in 2019, there weren't a lot of Bohemians basically after the 2010s, I would say. Most of the early breeders of Bohemians had disappeared. They'd either gotten out of pigeons altogether for health or other reasons, or they had passed away. By 2015, there were only a couple breeders with large flocks of Bohemians that were still raising birds that actually had a large enough flock to maintain genetic diversification. What happened is, you had a lot of breeders that may have 1 or 2 pair. They become inbred, or they end up crossbreeding them, or they get rid of them because they just didn't have enough breeders in their area where they could find outcrosses. So even if they liked the breed, it became very difficult to maintain the, the genetic integrity of the breed or the quality, once of course they crossbred the breed. In 2019, I had a catastrophic incident where a loss that I'd been using and my father had been using for several decades. We had a female raccoon with some babies get in and killed all of my Bohemians, all of my hens, and all of my cocks except for two. They had injured them, but they didn't actually die. So that was pretty devastating. And I had reached out to Merle Frank, and a lot of people who are familiar with the breed associate Bohemian Pouters with Merle Frank. He's really he is the individual that put a ton of work and effort in establishing the breed through the 80s and 90s, and just did a ton of backbreaking work to improve the breed and increase the distribution. And he pretty much knew every breeder. Unfortunately, in November of 2019, he suddenly passed away, and his birds, were dispersed, and he really didn't have too many at that point. Another gentleman who had most of his birds is now in his late 80s, early 90s, and suffers from dementia, and is also out of the breed. And so the breed sort of disappeared in a very short period of time. And it was at that point that I set out to do everything I could to reestablish the breed. And I knew that part of that was finding other breeders. And so during COVID, I went on a 3,000-mile road trip trying to visit breeders and that I know used to have the breed, and just sort of combing through the Midwest trying to find breeders that might know or former breeders that might know where I could find a bird or two. Mary Morris in Iowa, in northeastern Iowa, she has Bohemians, and she had a fairly large number of them, varying degrees of quality like everyone else, and some of hers had also needed to be crossed because she couldn't get out crosses, and I believe they had been crossed with American show racers and perhaps horsemen's and pouters as well. But I was able to get from her a few birds that I was able to breed to these cocks. And also in 2019, I met a gentleman by the name of Michael Koblenz. He's a nice young man that was raising Bohemians. He was at the Louisville National Young Bird Show, and he had one pair, and he'd raised some young. And we partnered together and have exchanged a number of birds to try to increase the his flock and my flock, and really to breed genetically diverse birds that we could pass back and forth. What happened is I realized that we needed a club, but first of all, you need members, and in order to really connect and build this network of known breeders, I created this American Bohemian Pouter Facebook group. And we've had a lot of people who used to raise the breed or who were friends of the breed who've come forward, and they may not even be able to raise pigeons any longer, but they've come on and shared memories and photos and pointed us in the right direction of people that have them. And so we've essentially created this network of known breeders. And since then, I personally raised several hundred Bohemians. In 2020, we got down to where, by my estimation of all the people that had Bohemians, we were probably somewhere in the vicinity of 100, and I'm rounding up, of pure Bohemian Pouters that were left in existence. Like I mentioned in my article, unlike all of the breeds of Pouters, we can't go to another country. We can't go to Germany or Austria and find breeders of this breed. It's our breed. It's an American heritage breed that was near extinction.
And if anybody is looking to get into this breed, that'd probably be the first stepping stone right there, right? Jump on that Facebook group and see if you can find somebody in your area.
Absolutely. I've given away several hundred birds. There's more than 30 breeders that have either started raising Bohemians for the first time or restarted raising the breed. And there's about a dozen breeders that have been suffering through this with me for some time. And so we definitely have more breeders than we've had in a long time. I'm happy to point people to the people, in their local area or in the region that have the birds. I mean, we shipped them from New England to California and from Florida to the Pacific Northwest and everywhere in between. So the breed has really been dispersed. Hopefully we start to see them showing up in the show hall once again, and we see the resurgence of this breed.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get this rebranded. So no more of this as American as apple pie. It's as American as the American Bohemian Pouter.
I love it very much. I work for a company, and a couple of our brands are Wilson and Louisville Slugger, and it's interesting. They're heritage American brands, of course, and it's funny. I use that a bit tongue in cheek, just professionally with my association there. I also work in the outdoor industry. We own a number of sporting good brands, but in any case, it's interesting because I mentioned this in the article, and I think it's so true. We as people, I think, and societally, we really value and cherish things that are foreign. We oftentimes place a greater value on something if it comes from some far off or exotic place, and we fail to recognize the significance and importance of something from our hometown or Main Street in the small town we grew up in. It always seems like the pasta is always better in Italy, or the beer's better in Germany, or the wine's better in France, but we always see that as being far superior to anything having come from our home. And I think failing to recognize the value of importance of what's local and what's ours, it's a big miss. And it's really the responsibility of us to safeguard these heritage breeds, these rare breeds that you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. And we need to band together to make sure that we take care of what is our breed. So just like how we can go back to Germany and find many rare breeds or color pigeons that are from that area, or the Czech Republic, etc., we should be able to preserve the breeds that are from here and place a greater degree of importance, not just on the American Bohemian Pouters, but the other breeds of rare breeds of pigeons that are from our country. And I think that's really the obligation that we should hold here to protect this very fragile hobby of ours that is under lots of different threats, and certainly genetic diversification and promotion is among them. And I think it's important to take pride in what our forefathers have created. And I think there's a responsibility that each of us should hold for the next generation of breeders, that we need to preserve what we have today and make sure that it's available and prevalent for the breeders of tomorrow. And that's really my rallying call is, I really want other breeders to, you don't need to convert your entire loft to raising Bohemians, but I think it would do us a lot of good to pick up a pair of rare breed birds that are heritage American birds from our area, and let's do what we can to preserve that breed and show them and promote them in our area.
Absolutely. Yeah, and anybody that's interested in this, definitely check out the Facebook page. It's the American Bohemian Pouter Facebook group, so you can jump on there, hopefully find something that you can find a breeder that you can get your hands on a few to get going. Yeah, let's see some of these at some shows. That'd be really great.
Absolutely.
So we're coming up against the clock here. Ryan, thanks for coming on and talking with us. I mean, it's really cool, man. It's cool to see someone who's really passionate about a certain breed and the effort. That 3,000-mile road trip for bringing up this breed and everything. That's so cool. It was a really great article too. If you guys don't get the Purebred Pigeon magazine, it's kind of like the closest thing to APJ or the American Pigeon Journal. It goes into a lot of different breeds. That one was all about pouters, and that's where we come across your article on there. So thanks for coming on with us and talking about this bird with us and all your efforts. That's what it takes. It takes all of us on this one. So
it sure does. And I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to get on and speak with you guys, and you really appreciate the time and attention for this breed. It's breed I think it's been underserved, and it's one that, I could talk for hours clearly on this breed. And it's one that, it's been the underdog. It's really coming around finally, and it's nice to see that resurgence. And it's not a breed that has a lot of problems. It's a breed that's actually, it's a healthy breed. They're striking, they're beautiful, they've got a great personality, they're excellent parents, and they're just simply underserved and underdistributed. And I'm making it my mission, amongst others, to help distribute this breed and to ensure that its preservation continues on for that next generation of breeder.
Brian, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.